For more on what we have learned so far in the impeachment hearings, Republican Congressman Tom Reed from New York. Good to have you, Congressman.
It's good to be with you, Chris.
I saw an earlier interview you gave to Chuck Todd where you said you didn't think this rose so far from what you've heard the level of impeachable behavior. I'm curious just what you view the standard that the Constitution sets out for you as being in bribery, treason, and other high crimes and misdemeanor.
Well, exactly that. High crimes and treasons, crimes that are subject to the penalty of death is essentially what the Constitution is, to me, indicating with impeachment. And this whole claim of bribery, the American people aren't stupid. Chris, this is not going to sustain the review of the American people, and they're the ultimate ones that are going to judge this, because I just don't see this becoming an impeachable offense that's subject to the removal of the president.
Well, just to be clear, the Constitution says bribery, which is not subject to the death penalty, obviously, bribery, treason, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, a category which has been used for all other impeachments. Like, you think Nixon should have been impeached, right?
I recognize. I mean, we're talking about a burglary charge there directed by the president. Pretty clear where that was going to go, and the president resigned. But you should learn the lesson of impeachment in the sense of how many times has this been utilized? We should learn from the Clinton proceedings, where that was a partisan exercise, in my humble opinion. I didn't support the Clinton impeachment, and that going forward should teach us. This is not impeachment is a very historic action, and the American people are looking at this, in my humble opinion, and some have already made up their minds. You clearly have made up a conclusion, as the evidence has brought you to the conclusions you indicated in your opening. But at the end of the day, this is about trusting the people, and I think that's going to be turned over to the election at the end of the day.
So back in 1998, when President Clinton was impeached, there was a movement that launched then called Censure and Move On, right? That became MoveOn.org. And the idea behind that was that the president should be censured. Bill Clinton should be censured. There should be an official congressional censure vote, but it didn't rise to high crimes and misdemeanors. And the argument there was that, look, the president has clearly done something wrong here. We do not approve of his behavior. We don't think that he should have had this sexual relationship with a White House intern, but it's not high crimes and misdemeanors. I'm curious, are you willing to say what the president's conduct here on the call on this rogue foreign policy and attempting to pressure Ukraine into manufacturing dirt or digging up dirt on his political opponent, that was not cool, that was not good, even if it's not impeachable?
How I view the evidence, me personally, is that he was raising the issue of corruption with the sitting vice president, Joe Biden. That's a legitimate exercise of executive discretion using taxpayer dollars in a way that doesn't go to a corrupt country.
Let me ask you a question. How many times did he say corruption on that call?
He's talking. You're asking where did I see the corruption in regards to the president? I don't see that here.
How many times did the President Trump, use the word corruption in talking about corruption on the phone call?
When you're looking at the issue of Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden getting a $50,000 a month salary for a job he clearly has no qualifications for, I think that on itself raises the question of something that needs to be investigated in Ukraine.
Why? What's the factual predicate for that investigation?
Because if you look at that, and when you see that the vice president, he verbally said on tape that they're going to withhold financial aid to Ukraine so long as the investigation of his son's company does not occur.
That was not what he said.
We're using that standard. That's exactly what he said. That's exactly what he said.
I just want to be clear about this. Do you know the name of that prosecutor?
That is the prosecutor from inside of the Ukraine.
Yeah. Do you know his name?
Yeah. The name is escaping me right now, Chris, but I will tell you
his name is Victor Shokin. His name is Victor Shokin, right? He was widely viewed by the U.S. and the EU as essentially covering up for corruption and failing to investigate.
Never been investigated, Chris. Never been investigated by any investigator. News reports have reached this conclusion. News reporters are not investigators, and I will just tell you right here, right now, you have an obligation as the President of the United States in order to make sure taxpayer dollars do not go to a corrupt organization or a corrupt country. So then why didn't he say, I mean, first of all, why didn't he say corruption? Second of all, do you think it is plausible? You talk about the American people. Do you think it's a plausible story that Donald Trump, a man who nearly awarded himself a huge government contract, who has okayed aid to Israel, where the prime minister there is under investigation, and to Egypt, where al-Sisi is notoriously corrupt, I think you and I would both agree on that, that all of a sudden, this man, Donald Trump, just gets real laser focused, real worked up about corruption in one particular instance with one particular country that just happens to pertain to the man that is going to run for president against him? Is that a plausible story in your mind? It is a plausible story in my mind, and I think the American people are going to see right through this. At the end of the day, this is about politics, short, simple, sweet. That's what it's about. And when you're talking about overturning the election of people of the United States, you better go at this in regards to smoking gun evidence to remove a duly elected president. You're tearing apart the structure of America with this attack that you all have concluded. Wait a second, but is a done deal.
I'm going to keep you for one more second, though, because I get that argument, and I agree with you. Impeachment is very serious, and I totally agree with that. It just seems that argument proves too much, right? Because if the idea is that you're overturning an election, then there's no point of having impeachment in the U.S. Constitution to begin with. It is there for a reason, right? We agree that it should be there, that it should be used in extreme circumstances. You're saying this isn't extreme enough, but it just seems to me a little bit of a disingenuous argument that it overturns an election when, by definition, that must be the case for any impeachment.
And I agree with you. It is in those extreme cases. Right. That's why in our history as a nation, this has never been done in regards to taking a president after a duly held election out of office. That is something that's never been done. Never been done in our history of a nation. And when you go down the path of impeachment, this isn't about playing a game of getting an indictment of an impeachment and that's the end of it. Right. This is about taking out the president of the United States, and we should leave this up to the American people.
All right, Congressman Tom Reed, thanks for making time tonight.
It's great to be with you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.